Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today we have trauma therapist Laurel Toorn to talk about what to do when a divorce drudges up suppressed trauma.
Hi.
So before we start in though, can you talk a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got into this particular kind of therapy?
Yeah. I was in grad school during a time when the understanding of trauma really broadened. Historically, trauma was something that people only thought that combat veterans, survivors of assault, and kind of like and first responders could experience. And that's definitely not the case. We're now understanding that trauma is anything that overwhelms your ability to cope. And therefore everyone can experience trauma. And being in grad school, training for this profession, right as that expansion of the understanding of trauma was happening, really got me kind of locked in on trauma as like, yes, this is what I want to do. And there was also a whole lot of research about what treatments work really well for trauma. And I was really lucky very early in my career to be trained in a type of therapy called EMDR therapy. Stands for eye movement desensitization and reprogramming or reprocessing, sorry. And that training and just seeing how effective it was and how much it was helping people is just so invigorating as a provider to see people really heal, to really work through some deep stuff. Um, Prior to going to grad school, I had worked in several crisis response centers for sexual assault. So I was kind of always on the trauma train, and then just seeing, okay, most people have some trauma, and there are very effective tools that we can use to really help them do some deep healing. It just makes the work so rewarding. People always say to me, "Oh, being a trauma therapist, it must be so hard." And I say, "Well, yeah, there are hard moments, but the actual work is not as hard as people expect because I get to see the healing and I just have that front row seat to human resilience. And I can keep going for a couple more decades."
I like that. And you have this whole group of clients who are I get you we call high achievers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And lawyers, I guess doctors,
Yep.
those kind of
Mm-hmm.
people. And
Yep.
and when I was going through your stuff, it was fascinating because my brain went to, well, you'd think high achievers would
Mm-hmm.
be really the best people to handle a divorce because they're,
Mm-hmm.
they can overcome anything. They can think, they can,
Mm-hmm.
be rational and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you say that that's not necessarily true, really, when it comes
No.
in for a divorce. And
Yeah.
there are reasons that high achievers can struggle with a divorce. Can we kind of talk about that?
Absolutely. The I like to say a lot of people are replicating an early environment in their career or an early schema or a message they got. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't mean to say like, oh, all lawyers are traumatized or all, doctors
We
are
are.
traumatized, all entrepreneurs. But I think that for a lot of people that I work with, they grew up in a stressful environment and are replicating that stressful environment in their career because it's familiar.
Yeah.
They go into an OR and they're like, yeah, this frantic pace is familiar to me. This feels safe. I can do this, right? So it's this kind of low level, I'm going to call it low level trauma, that it's often an attachment wound or, something that happened early on that it's not all, it doesn't set you on a disaster course. Like sometimes our early negative experiences really inform the choices we make, and we go on to do a lot of good in the world as a result. And sometimes we get to a point where it exceeds our ability to cope. And we have no other coping skills besides working hard,
Yeah.
kind of pushing more and perhaps avoiding emotion. And that's where I see people run into trouble is when their coping skills are not enough to handle a stressful career and a personal life
Yeah.
disaster or trauma. Yeah.
you would think that also for people who are so used to success, um,
Yeah.
divorce is almost never a success.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's the
I mean,
least amount of
occasionally it
things.
can be, but it's not what people
It
had in
can be,
mind when they
but
got
it's like,
married.
yeah, it's you know, if I can do this and I can do that, why
Hmm.
can't I make my spouse
Yeah.
understand?
Right.
And that kind of it almost like a fear of failure kind of kicks in
Yes.
for some
Well,
people.
and divorce can feel like a failure. Like I
Yeah.
invested so much. I brought everything I could to this relationship and it wasn't enough.
Yep.
And that
Yep.
can be a real like ego crisis for sure.
So if I come in and I'm one of those folks
Yeah.
and I'm getting a divorce and I go, I just don't understand. I mean, I, 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 I'm not making this work, and now I
Hmm.
don't understand what I'm doing, and now I need some help,
Yeah.
and I don't know why all my old, I don't want to say tricks, but
Hmm.
skills,
Hmm.
in my work life aren't working here. I
I
mean, how
know.
do you start getting around that?
Yeah. It's so different for each person, but when fundamentally, when we have a major relationship dissolve, whether that's through divorce or just, whatever it is, could also be honestly a friendship. Like some people going through a friendship breakup, like a long-term deep friendship, losing that can trigger this as well. And we don't expect the intensity of the loss of a friendship, right?
Yeah.
It could also be, a family of origin disconnect or a child cutting you off. These attachment traumas, these ruptures in relationship, they really trigger our attachment system. Our attachment system is built early on in life, and it is your way of approaching relationship. Now, a lot of people have probably heard about this, that your attachment style there's four styles. There's secure attachment, usually means you had parents that did a good enough job of attuning to you and your emotions and your sadness and anxiety and fear as a kid and giving you skills to help manage those feelings. Secure attachment is good enough attunement from parenting. And then anxious attachment is parents that were maybe misattuned or neglectful, and you kind of are always seeking that safety and reassurance from others. That's going to show up in a marriage or, another relationship. And what we often see is someone with an anxious attachment style partner with someone that has an avoidant attachment style, which is
Mm.
someone that doesn't want to get too close,
Yeah.
but they're not going to leave. They're just going to kind of be half in. And the reason we see this pairing so often is because it feels familiar to the anxious attachment person, that it feels familiar to the kind of inconsistent attunement of a parent.
Yeah.
So when something feels familiar to us, it feels safe. Just like I was saying, a stressful work environment feels familiar if you grew up in a stressful home. And then the final attachment style is a disorganized attachment where you kind of vacillate between anxious and avoidant. And this is usually a result of like some pretty significant childhood trauma, particularly around your caregivers. So if you had a parent die suddenly, or a parent that was in and out of prison, or parents that were kind of cycling through different relationships, or had major substance abuse problems, that's going to show up as a really disorganized attachment style. And without fail, when someone is going through a divorce, their attachment style gets really activated. So if they were a little bit anxiously attached before, they look extremely anxiously attached going through a divorce, and
Yeah.
vice versa. And even for the securely attached, the grief of losing that primary relationship is just devastating. So, to some extent, your attachment style doesn't matter. It's going to be hard to go through a big relationship transition. And a lot of behavior that may not make sense to us, or behavior that feels extreme or kind of ungrounded, can really be attributed to that attachment style getting triggered.
I was looking at some of the stuff you talk about and about how to kind of start to get out of that.
Yeah.
And you said something like you got to start to reframe
Mm,
what you're feeling. And I
mm,
thought that was fascinating.
hmm.
Just that because that's maybe the hardest part.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and insight alone isn't enough to feel better, right? It has to be insight paired with behavior change, paired with positive coping, paired with healing some trauma. Then you're actually going to start to feel different.
The Can you talk you mentioned at the very beginning EMDR,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
is that a type of therapy that is particular for high achievers, or could be for any trauma people,
No, for
or
anyone
how?
with trauma. Yeah. And there's actually applications beyond trauma as well. But it was originally developed and researched for trauma, it was specifically in combat veterans, but then they were seeing like, oh, it actually works for a lot of trauma. Um, a lot of times when people talk about EMDR, they go like really technical and into this like neuroscientific language. And I know for me, like my eyes just glaze over when you start talking about the hippocampus. It's like, okay, like I know what you're saying, but it doesn't feel real. Like if I'm having a conversation with someone, I'm not aware of my hippocampal activity, you know? So, um, I try and explain it in a way that feels real to people. In the 1980s, Dr. Francine Shapiro, who is a research psychologist, was taking a walk in a park in Brooklyn and thinking about something really upsetting that had happened to her. And she was feeling that like agitation in her body. And as she was walking, she was moving her eyes from side to side along the sidewalk. And she discovered after about 10 minutes, she no longer felt that physical disturbance in her body, like the memory had been neutralized. And she went, huh, okay, I wonder what that was about. And so she went back to her research lab and started researching bilateral stimulation, which is side to side movement or anything that's side to side, and how that affects memory processing. And what she found is that stimulating both sides of the brain or both sides of the body, which attaches to the brain while talking about something really upsetting, helps the brain recategorize the memory. So if I were to ask you, Steve, to recount your last trip to the grocery store, would you have a big emotional reaction to that?
No.
No, because your brain has stored it like a typical memory. Like you probably
Yeah.
wouldn't even be able to recall that many details. Like
Yep.
maybe some of the items you bought, maybe which checkout line you went to, depending, maybe the time of day, but it's not like a crystal clear memory that evokes a body sensation. I'm not going to, but if I were to ask you to describe something really upsetting that happened to you, you would be able to tell me a lot of detail
Yeah.
and a lot of like specific detail and the body sensation and the emotion that you had while thinking about it. So what EMDR does is help an upsetting memory be stored like that grocery store memory. It's just like, okay, it's no longer critical to my survival that I remember every painful detail of this. I can log it away. You're never going to forget it, and you're never going to lose the lessons and the meaning from it. But you will be able to move on and just feel like it doesn't have this grip on you and that you're not at any point seconds from being thrown into that physiological tension and discomfort of the memory. That gets neutralized in the EMDR process. So a lot of people just find tremendous relief and comfort after going through EMDR therapy. As far as what it looks like, there are 8 phases of EMDR, and each phase is a little different. The one that gets all the attention is phase 4, where you're talking about the upsetting thing and either having eye movement that goes side to side. We can do beeping in the ears. We can do self-tapping just with your hands on opposite shoulders. It's any bilateral stimulation. So phase 4 is the one that gets all the attention because it's weird. It's super weird.
Mhm. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of makes sense though. I
Yeah.
mean,
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to say you're almost distracting yourself from your memory.
Yes. No, that's
but you're
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, you're not fixating on it, and that's got to
Yes.
be good.
Yeah. And I like to say, like, an EMDR therapy can be very intense because you do have to fully access the memory. Now, some of the early phases are giving you coping skills and the ability to tolerate the intensity of it. So you don't want to just want to be dropped into it. But I like to say, okay, like this is going to be intense. Let's imagine we're a train going through a tunnel. We are going to come out the other side, but we just got to keep going through it. And then you come out to the other side. And, I've had people that after, we processed for a few sessions, they had a tremendous fear of flying. They were able to get on a plane without getting activated.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Like there's truly like a brain shift that happens. And I just love it so much. And for high achievers, they've often been able to cope well enough throughout their life, and then divorce or, some, major family shift is the
Yeah.
thing that kind of pushes them over the edge and they can't cope anymore. And a past trauma is now really weighing on them in a way that it wasn't before.
Is obviously, divorce is a deal, but is there any, it's kind of crazy, quite
Hmm.
crazy question, particular time it's really important to start thinking about trying to fix it? Uh,
Yeah.
it can they just get set so much that it becomes very difficult?
Yeah. Um, well, complex trauma is like a childhood attachment thing, and that takes a good deal of time to heal, even with EMDR, which is a faster modality than other trauma therapies. It still isn't a couple sessions and you're done.
Yeah.
But as far as like when is the right time for EMDR, honestly, the sooner the better. They say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Um, I actually, this is, I was going through my EMDR training. It's a lengthy training process. It's not just like a weekend course. And in the middle of that training, I was in a very, very scary car accident. And the next day, I was in an EMDR therapy session because if you access EMDR therapy earlier, it's much less likely you will develop PTSD. And so there are even some organizations that dispatch EMDR therapists to disaster zones and do a version of EMDR that can be done kind of relatively quickly and really prevent PTSD
Yeah.
because it just helps access your positive coping skills and helps your brain store it more like a typical memory.
Yeah. It's funny because in a lot of really high conflict divorces,
Hmm.
we see people coming out of it, even if they get what they want and it
Yeah.
seems like it's okay with that syndrome.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, you know, God, I wish I'd have done this like earlier
Hmm.
because now the divorce is over and I'm just I don't know how to get out.
Yeah.
Um, it, it's difficult.
Yeah,
So
it can feel like a Pyrrhic victory where like the
yeah,
cost was not
exactly.
worth what you won. Hmm.
Yep, yep.
Hmm.
And do you is this a group kind of or an individual
No,
thing?
it's individual therapy. Yeah. The earlier you can get in, I think the less time it'll take. But again, every person is bringing such a unique history
Yeah,
to EMDR. There's something called a float back, and I think that in most divorces, the trauma that's getting kicked up is not just the relationship itself. Sometimes it is, but I would say most of the time, again, it's that attachment trauma that we're looking at. It is something very deep and raw. So in EMDR therapy, the float back is like you think you're coming in because your boss yelled at you and you had an outsized reaction.
right.
And then what it actually is going back to a caregiver that yelled at you for doing something that you didn't know was wrong, right? And that you felt unsafe in that situation. So that float back of like finding the early memory, we call it first or worst memory, can really, even as an adult, like you objectively know you were safe as a kid when you were being yelled at. Your physical safety
Right.
from yelling was not a threat, but your emotional safety as a child is often just as important as your physical safety, and that the body doesn't understand the difference
Yep.
between emotional safety and physical safety. So those float backs that come up when I'm working with someone that's going through a divorce or like a major, family rupture, they're really interesting because they're like, I know I'm an adult. I know I'm not being currently yelled at by my parent, and yet my body reaction is such that it
Yep.
feels like I am. And going back and being able to heal that has a domino effect to the present. And
Yeah.
that you're able to, if you go back and process those childhood wounds and really make great process there, then the divorce process gets a lot easier. It's never easy, but it gets a lot easier.
It feels almost like a legacy thing because
Hmm.
if you can do that,
Yeah.
you have kids and you're
Yes.
going through divorce, you may not be as quick to do what to them what they did to you. Kind of break
Exactly.
that
Yes.
spiral.
Yes. Be a cycle breaker. And I'm really glad you brought up kids because that is often a motivator for people
Yeah.
seeking therapy and trying to do their own work because they don't want to pass on that legacy.
Yeah.
And, I don't think, as far as kids, I don't think divorce is always the worst thing for kids.
Right.
I mean, there's something to be said for seeing your parent happy and free and maybe in a new relationship that feels more balanced and authentic to them. I think that we can't just make a blanket statement that divorce is always bad for kids because it's not,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a lot more nuance there. And doing the attachment work. And I see a lot of people coming in for therapy when their child is the age they were when something bad happened to them. That there's something like seeing their child be the age they were gives them a totally different perspective and kind of like, oh, the story I was telling myself about that thing that happened to me as a kid makes no sense in the context of looking at my own child. So if something bad happens to a kid, there may be a narrative around, oh, it was my fault. I did something to provoke it. And then they see their precious child, their sweet, innocent child, and they're like, there is nothing this child that is the same age that I was could do to warrant that being their fault
Yeah.
or being okay.
Yeah.
And then that triggers this kind of breakdown of the narrative that has fortified them for a long time and brings them to a place where they actually want to do the healing work. And that's incredibly rewarding. And I just think, what a gift to yourself and what a gift to your child.
Yeah. Really.
Yeah.
It, someone who comes to you and successfully goes through it
Mm-hmm.
but is it over then?
Mm,
Or is it still an ongoing thing? I know
mm,
I saw something you talked about, which was, you know, daily coping strategies. And
yeah.
it feels like that's something that it's for the rest of your life.
Mm. I mean, yes, we're always all going to need coping strategies. So there's something called the window of tolerance. When you're in the window of tolerance, you can think, feel, and act at the same time. And like it's kind of like hopefully your baseline. You're just kind of like normal. Like in and like, yeah, I'm alert, but I'm relaxed. I'm like, pleasantly engaged or just kind of neutrally engaged in life. If you're outside the window of tolerance, you're either extremely anxious and agitated and worked up, or you're numbed and depressed and completely dissociated. And we find that people going through a divorce are in their window of tolerance shrinks. It's much smaller. So they're knocked out of that window of tolerance more often because the stress is exceeding their ability to cope. So an important part of therapy is widening that window of tolerance. So like 80-90% of the time you're in that window.
Yeah.
And then when you do get knocked out, you have the coping skills to help yourself get back into it.
Yeah.
And that really is the long and short of it. As far as EMDR is very useful in widening that window of tolerance so that you're just kind of at a healthy baseline more often. As far as, going through EMDR, is it then over? I think that there are other experiences besides trauma that get kicked up in a divorce. So
Okay.
grief. Grief is not something you can magic your way out of. Grief is a process that has to be gone through. It takes a couple years when it's simple grief, and when it's complex grief, it takes longer. And it's not something, grief is never done. It just stings less, and kind of that like gutting and that just hollowness in your chest starts to feel less intense. So I always like to let people like to manage expectations. Like you're not just gonna feel carefree
Yeah.
after EMDR, but you're gonna feel like your capacity is greater, even if the capacity is still exceeded sometimes.
Right. And
Yeah.
and if you start to fall back, which everyone
Mm-hmm.
kind of does, is that can they like with come to you again, like I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
for a refill, for
Yeah.
kind of a
Yeah.
clean
I
them
mean,
up for.
effective EMDR, we don't see that happening very often. Like, it's usually someone would come back and need to do more work on the same theme if it was a pretty complex
Got
thing.
it.
So let's say, I like to say, like, you line up the dominoes, but that you have multiple lines of dominoes. So one line of dominoes is abandonment. The other line of dominoes is injustice. The other line of dominoes is being forgotten. And if you can find the right domino in EMDR, you can take out the whole line, but you have more than
Wow.
one line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. I mean, and that's
Mm-hmm.
powerful.
Very powerful. That's why I say it's so invigorating to me to do
Yeah.
this work because I just see such a transformation. It doesn't feel like a radical transformation in the moment. But then, I do get someone comes into a session and they say like, I realize I'm ready to date again. And I'm actually
Yeah.
like excited about opening up my life and my heart. And like they could not have fathomed that a year
Wow.
prior, right?
Wow.
Or, you know, um, figuratively or literally going back to ground zero and being okay. And just being like, wow, I didn't think the work we did together was that impactful. But then I realized like I was at the site of my greatest trauma and I was in the window of tolerance.
But-
Like
so
that's
it's
profound.
it's a I don't want to say sticky, but I mean it's one of those things that once it
Yeah.
happens,
Yeah.
you don't have to worry every day of your life if
Nope.
I'm going to go back there.
Nope. No, if it's truly been effectively processed with EMDR, the effects are permanent.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Laura, we're unfortunately running out of time, but before we
Yeah.
go, I want to ask if, someone would like to get a hold of you
Yeah.
or learn more about this,
hmm
how can they do that?
Our website is laureltherapy.net. If you want to learn more about EMDR, we have a free webinar that you can watch on our website that we have a fake client. Her name is Jessie, and she had a college sports injury. So her career trajectory was that she was going to be a pro athlete and she had this injury. And so that's the trauma. And we take her through all 8 phases of EMDR and what it looked like for her and explain in a little more detail, but still using plain language. It's
Yeah,
about an hour long. So if you really want to dive into what EMDR looks like, that's a resource on our website. And then we also have a lot of blog articles and information about different parts, people being worried like, well, if I go through EMDR therapy, will I lose my edge? And the answer is no. You will lose your
yeah.
anxiety, not your edge.
You're not dumbing your brain down.
No, no, you keep the lesson, you leave the
Yeah,
trauma. Hmm
yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. That's wonderful. And speaking of, plain speaking, what
Yeah.
I loved about today was again, sort of talked at the beginning.
Hmm.
you explained this really complex and
Yeah.
issue in terms that like even I can understand. And
Hmm.
so that is so much more relieving when people don't leave and go, I don't know what half of that meant,
Yeah.
you know. So
And
that's
knowledge
wonderful.
is power. Knowledge is
Yep,
power.
knowledge is power. Well, thank you again for being here. This was just really good and and I think important, especially for people in, like you said, any kind of trauma situation. So thank you for being
Yeah.
here.
Very happy to be here. Thanks.
It was great. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. If anyone has any further questions on today's topic, you can always post it here and we can get you connected with Laurel, or you can just go to her straight yourself. So until next time, stay safe, stay happy.